The boarding area felt like a room holding its breath. Outside the glass, the sky over the coast had turned an ugly shade of green-gray, like metal left too long in dirty water. Wind pushed the palm trees sideways. Rain came in sharp bursts, then stopped, then came again harder, as if the storm could not decide whether it wanted to warn people or punish them. Inside, the airport was loud in the way panic can be loud without anyone actually shouting. Screens kept flashing the same two words like a bad loop: delayed and canceled. Families argued in low voices. Travelers refreshed weather apps until their thumbs hurt. A few people stared at the runway like they were watching a door close slowly. One flight was still boarding. It was a narrow-body jet headed north, and the gate agent said it would be one of the last departures before shutdown. That sentence did something to people. Turned walking into running. It turned maybe into now. People who usually moved with calm confidence suddenly looked like they were late to something that mattered more than pride. Among the crowd, there was a woman who did not run. She moved at a steady pace, not slow, not fast. It was the kind of pace that made it feel like she already knew how this would go. She carried a small bag that sat close to her body and a backpack that looked light. No flashy brand. No heavy suitcase. Just enough. She stepped around hurried travelers without bumping anyone. People shifted to make room for her without meaning to. It wasn't fear. It was something quieter, like the way a group unconsciously parts for a person who seems sure of their direction. When she reached the plane, she found her seat in the forward section of economy. Row 8, window. She sat down like she had done this 1,000 times. Bag under the seat, backpack overhead, seatbelt clipped, shoulders relaxed. She opened a paperback novel with a worn cover. The kind of book someone reads when they don't need entertainment, just something to hold in their hands. The man in the middle seat glanced at her for half a second. She looked like any other traveler. Quiet, focused, not interested in talking. He put on his headphones and stared at his phone, relieved that his seatmate wasn't the type to overshare. Nobody looked at her twice. The cabin filled quickly. A flight attendant closed overhead bins with sharp, efficient movements. The intercom chimed. The safety message played. The jet bridge pulled away. Outside the window, rain began again, slanting sideways, turning the ground crew into small figures hunched against the wind. The aircraft pushed back. It rolled toward the runway, and the engines spooled up with a low growl that made the seat vibrate. The woman by the window didn't look up from her book, but her fingers paused on the page. She listened not like a nervous flyer listens, but like someone who has learned to hear small differences in normal sounds. The plane turned onto the runway and stopped for a moment. The lights stretched forward into the storm-dark distance. Then the engines surged, and the aircraft began to move faster and faster, the runway lines blurring, the roar rising. Takeoff. The jet lifted into the air and climbed into a sky that looked bruised. The cabin tilted, pressure changed in everyone's ears, and the city fell away beneath them. A few people clapped softly, the way people sometimes do when they think they just escaped something. At first, it was ordinary turbulence. The aircraft bumped and shook through a layer of weather. Drinks rattled in cups. A child laughed because children sometimes mistake danger for a ride. The seatbelt light stayed on, and the flight attendants held on to seatbacks as they moved. Then it smoothed out. The aircraft climbed above the worst of the storm and into calmer air. The cabin settled. People exhaled. Some went back to their screens. Some fell asleep. A few texted family members. "We took off. Looks okay." The woman in row 8 turned a page. She wasn't really reading. Not fully. Her eyes scanned the lines, but part of her attention stayed elsewhere, as if her body was listening to the plane. Minutes passed. Then something changed, and most people didn't notice it at all. It wasn't a bang. There was no dramatic pop of masks dropping. No sudden rush of wind. It was smaller than that, so small that it felt almost like a mood shifting in the room. A faint lightness in the head. A warmth that didn't belong. A sleepy comfort that tried to convince the brain that everything was fine. The man in the middle seat yawned and blamed the long day. A woman across the aisle rubbed her eyes and blamed the dim cabin lights. Someone laughed quietly at a joke on their phone, and it sounded slightly too slow, slightly delayed. The woman in row 8 stopped turning pages. She took one breath, then another, and her expression changed in a way that would have meant nothing to a stranger. But to someone trained to notice, it was a switch flipping from rest to action. She looked up, not toward the windows, not toward the passengers, but toward the front of the aircraft, as if she could see through the walls. In the cockpit, the captain reached for the intercom with a hand that didn't move quite right. The voice that came through the speakers was not calm. It was strained, edged, wrong. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain said, and the words dragged slightly, like they were heavy. "We're in trouble. We have a problem." The cabin went still, and before anyone could ask what kind of problem, before a single oxygen mask fell, the captain's voice cut off mid-breath. In the cockpit, both pilots slumped forward. For 3 seconds after the captain's voice cut out, nobody moved. It was the kind of silence that does not belong inside an airplane. Even nervous flights have sound: engines, air vents, small talk, someone coughing. But this silence felt thick, like the air itself had changed. The woman in row 8 was already standing. Not fast, not dramatic. She unbuckled her seat belt and rose with steady control, as if this moment had been waiting for her instead of surprising her. The man beside her blinked up at her, confused. "Are they serious?" he asked, his words slightly slow. She didn't answer him. Her body already knew what her mind had confirmed. The lightness in her head, the warmth creeping behind her eyes, the strange calm spreading through the cabin. It wasn't fear. It was oxygen deprivation, hypoxia. She had trained for it for years, in simulators, in high-altitude flights, in rooms where instructors had quietly lowered oxygen levels to see how long it took for pilots to notice their own thinking slipping. Most people never realize it's happening. They feel relaxed, a little dreamy, maybe even happy, and then they pass out. She stepped into the aisle. A flight attendant near the front was trying to reach the cockpit phone, her movements unsteady, her balance slightly off. She looked pale, her eyes unfocused. The woman in row 8 reached her in seconds. "You're losing cabin pressure," she said calmly. Her voice cut through the fog like a clear line. "The pilots are likely hypoxic. We have minutes before people start collapsing." The flight attendant stared at her, trying to process the words. "What?" she managed. "I need the cockpit door open. Now." The training of every airline employee screamed against that sentence. No one opens the cockpit door mid-flight. Not for a passenger. Not for anyone. But something about the woman's tone did not feel like a request. Felt like fact. "I'm a military helicopter commander," she continued, still calm, still precise. "I've trained for high-altitude oxygen loss. The crew is likely unconscious or close to it. If we don't descend immediately, everyone in this cabin will lose consciousness." Behind them, a passenger slumped sideways in his seat. Another rubbed her face as if trying to wake up from a nap. The flight attendant's fear shifted. It wasn't fear of protocol anymore. It was fear of time running out. She unlocked the door. The woman stepped inside. The cockpit was worse than she expected, but not by much. Both pilots were slumped in their seats, breathing shallow, hands loose on the controls. The aircraft was still climbing. The autopilot was doing exactly what it had been told to do: continue to altitude, which meant the air outside was getting thinner. She moved fast now, but without panic. First, she disengaged the autopilot. The aircraft responded immediately, nose dipping slightly as she guided it downward. She pushed forward gently but firmly, initiating an emergency descent. The change in angle caused a ripple of gasps from the cabin behind her. Then she reached for the oxygen masks above the pilots. She secured one over the captain's face, turning the flow to maximum. Then the first officer. Her movements were practiced, efficient, almost mechanical. She had done this before, not in this aircraft, but in others. She grabbed the radio. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Commercial flight experiencing rapid decompression. Both pilots incapacitated." Military-trained pilot taking temporary control. Initiating emergency descent to 10,000 feet. There was a pause on the frequency. Air traffic control did not expect to hear that. Say again, the controller replied carefully. Confirm. Passenger is flying the aircraft? Affirmative, she answered without hesitation. I am trained. We are descending now. Request vectors to nearest suitable airport. The aircraft passed through lower altitude quickly. The cabin pressure began to stabilize as thicker air surrounded the fuselage. Behind her, oxygen masks finally dropped from the ceiling. A few passengers fumbled with them, their hands clumsy but improving as oxygen returned. In the captain's seat, the pilot stirred. His eyes fluttered open. He looked confused, then alarmed, then shocked when he saw someone else in his position. You're hypoxic, she told him firmly. Stay on oxygen. We're descending. Help me with systems check once you're clear. He stared at her for a second, trying to understand. Then training took over. He nodded weakly. The cabin noise changed. It was no longer the heavy quiet of oxygen starvation. It was sharp, alive, full of frightened whispers and uneven breathing. The aircraft leveled briefly at a safer altitude. Outside, through the cockpit glass, two dark shapes appeared in the distance. Small at first, then clearer. Helicopters, military Black Hawks on training flight, monitoring emergency frequency. One of the pilots inside those helicopters had heard her voice, and he knew it. He pressed his transmit button. Commercial aircraft declaring emergency, he said. This is Army Black Hawk flight. Confirm. The pilot in command just identified as a military helicopter commander. She recognized the call sign before he even finished speaking. Her reply carried a slight change now, not emotion but recognition. Affirmative. This is Commander Storm. There was a brief silence on the frequency. Then the helicopter pilot answered with quiet respect. Copy that, Commander. We have you in sight. We'll stay with you. Inside the cockpit, the commercial captain looked at her fully now, awareness returning to his eyes. You're flying this? He asked. For the moment, she said. And ahead of them, the runway lights of the nearest airport began to glow through the storm-dark sky. The storm did not look dangerous from above. That was the strange part. From the cockpit window, it looked almost peaceful now. Layers of dark clouds below them, soft white edges where sunlight tried to break through. If someone had taken a picture at that moment, it would have looked like a travel magazine cover. But inside the cockpit, nothing felt peaceful. The woman in row 8, Commander Storm, kept one hand steady on the controls while her eyes moved quickly across the instruments. Altitude, airspeed, engine performance, cabin pressure, fuel. Every number mattered. The commercial captain was breathing deeply through his oxygen mask, color slowly returning to his face. His voice was clearer now but still heavy. You caught it before the warning system did, he said quietly, almost to himself. She didn't respond to the compliment. Instead, she focused on the next problem. The aircraft had descended to safer air, but they were still in unstable weather. Strong winds were moving in uneven patterns. Rain bands were forming ahead of them. Lightning flashed inside distant clouds like silent cameras going off. Air traffic control came back on the radio. You are cleared direct to the nearest airport. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Wind gusting from the east. Moderate turbulence reported on final approach. She nodded once, even though the controller could not see her. Copy, she said. Request updated wind speed and runway condition. Her tone was simple, calm. No extra words. Behind them, the two Black Hawks moved closer. They kept a respectful distance, flying slightly behind and to the left. Not interfering, just present. Inside one of the helicopters, the pilot watched the commercial jet carefully. She's steady, he said to his co-pilot. No overcorrección. Smooth inputs. The co-pilot glanced at the larger aircraft. She really hasn't trained on that jet? No, he replied. But flying is flying. And she's better than most. Back in the cockpit of the jet, the woman adjusted the descent rate. The runway was still far, but visible through the haze. The storm was not done with them yet. A sudden pocket of air hit the aircraft. The jet dropped slightly, not dramatically, but enough to make the cabin gasp. The captain's hand moved instinctively toward the controls. She noticed. "I have it," she said firmly. He paused. For a second, pride tried to step in. He had flown for decades. This was his aircraft, his responsibility. But he remembered what it felt like 5 minutes ago, unable to think clearly, unable to move properly. He nodded instead. "You have it." She adjusted power gently, not fighting the turbulence, not forcing it. She allowed the aircraft to move with the air instead of against it. Small corrections, precise. Passengers in the cabin held hands now. Some were praying. Some were crying quietly. A few were staring straight ahead, too overwhelmed to react. The oxygen masks had been removed. Breathing was normal again, but fear had taken oxygen's place. In row 8, the empty seat by the window made one man realize something strange. The quiet woman he had barely noticed earlier was gone, and somehow everything had changed. In the cockpit, the runway grew larger. 5 miles, air traffic control announced. Wind gusting, light rain over threshold. She adjusted the flaps carefully as the captain walked her through the sequence. He spoke slower than usual, but clear. "Speed check, flaps set. Landing gear on your command." "Landing gear," she said. The gear lowered with a solid mechanical sound. 3 green lights. Locked. The Black Hawk pilot's voice returned briefly on the emergency frequency. "Commander, we're on your left. You're lined up well." She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. "Stay clear of my approach path," she replied softly. "And thank you." The rain grew heavier for a moment, streaking across the windshield. Visibility dropped slightly. Not enough to abort, but enough to demand focus. At 3 miles, the world narrowed. There was no storm. No helicopters. No frightened passengers. There was only airspeed, altitude, glide slope, and the runway lights ahead. The captain watched her hands. They were relaxed, not stiff, not shaking, just steady. "You've done this before," he said quietly. She answered without looking at him. "Evelended verse." 2 miles. Wind shift from the right. She adjusted rudder input gently, keeping the nose aligned with the runway centerline. 1 mile. The runway numbers were clear now. The storm had shifted slightly behind them. The worst of it had passed. 500 feet, the automated voice announced. The aircraft was stable, perfectly stable. The captain felt something he had not expected to feel in this situation. Trust. At 50 feet above the runway, she began the flare. It was smooth, not rushed, not aggressive. The main wheels touched the runway with a solid, controlled thud. Not hard, not soft, right? Reverse thrust engaged. Brakes applied gradually. The aircraft slowed. The runway rushed beneath them, then slowed, then almost stopped. Finally, the jet rolled clear of the active runway and came to a full halt. For a few seconds, nobody inside moved. Then the cabin erupted. Not in screaming, but in a strange mixture of crying, laughter, and applause that sounded half-shocked, half-grateful. In the cockpit, the woman in row 8 released the controls. The captain removed his oxygen mask fully and looked at her. "You saved them," he said. She shook her head once. "No," she replied quietly. "We saved them." Outside, the 2 Black Hawks circled once before peeling away, returning to their training route. On the emergency frequency, one final message came through. "Storm," the helicopter pilot said. "Good landing, Commander." She allowed herself the smallest smile. "Just another mission," she answered. But everyone who had heard her voice that day knew it was far more than that. For the first time since the captain's voice had cracked over the intercom, the aircraft was completely still. The engines hummed at idle. Rain tapped lightly against the windows. Red and blue emergency lights flashed across the wet runway outside, reflecting off the metal skin of the plane like silent applause. Inside the cabin, people were not cheering anymore. They were crying. Not loud, not dramatic, Just quiet tears from people who understood how close they had come to something final. A child hugged his mother so tightly that she could barely breathe. A businessman who had complained about his seat earlier sat frozen, staring at his hands like he had never really seen them before. A woman in the back whispered, "Thank you," over and over again, though no one was sure who she was thanking. In the cockpit, the woman from row 8 leaned back slightly for the first time. The adrenaline was fading now. Her breathing slowed. The commercial captain looked at her again, but this time with full awareness. His hands were steady again. His voice had returned to normal. "You didn't hesitate," he said quietly. She shook her head once. There wasn't time. Outside, airport vehicles surrounded the aircraft. Fire crews stood ready, though there was no fire. Medical teams waited, though no one needed urgent treatment now. Procedures had to be followed. Reports had to be written. Questions had to be answered. The door opened. A senior airport official stepped into the cockpit, headset still on, eyes wide in disbelief. "Who landed the aircraft?" he asked. The captain didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly and gestured toward the woman. "She did." The official blinked. "Your crew?" "No," she replied calmly. "Passenger." Silence filled the cockpit again, but this time it was disbelief, not danger. In the cabin, word had started to spread. It was the lady from row 8. The quiet one. "She's military. She saved us." People turned toward the front as she finally stepped out of the cockpit and into the aisle. The same aisle she had walked earlier without anyone noticing her. Now every eye followed her. She did not wave. She did not smile for attention. She simply walked back toward her original seat to retrieve her bag. As she reached row 8, the man who had sat beside her stood up slowly. "I didn't even," he began, struggling for words. "I didn't even look at you." She met his eyes briefly. "That's okay," she said gently. "You weren't supposed to." He nodded, emotion rising in his throat. Passengers began clapping again. But this time it wasn't out of shock. It was gratitude, real and heavy. She did not stay to receive it. When the aircraft door opened and the jet bridge connected, she waited until most people had stepped off. She moved with the same steady pace she had boarded with. On the tarmac below, the two Black Hawks hovered briefly before landing nearby. Their blades cut through the damp air, strong and controlled. When the helicopter pilots stepped out, they didn't run. They didn't rush forward. They walked toward her. One of them stopped a few feet away and came to attention out of instinct, not ceremony. "Commander," he said respectfully. Around them, airport staff stared, confused. "Is that true?" One ground worker whispered to another. "She's their commander?" The helicopter pilot nodded without hesitation. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's our commander." The title moved through the small group like electricity. Commander. The same quiet woman who had sat by the window reading a book 30 minutes earlier. The same woman no one had noticed. The commercial captain joined them, now fully recovered. "I owe you," he said sincerely. She looked at him firmly. "You don't owe me anything. You did your job. I did mine." He shook his head. "My job was to protect those passengers. You protected all of us." For a moment, she didn't respond. Then she spoke softly. "The mission is always the same," she said. "Bring everyone home." There were cameras now. Phones lifted. Reporters who had heard the emergency call were arriving quickly. Questions started forming before answers were ready. But she stepped slightly back from the crowd. She did not look like someone chasing recognition. She looked like someone who had simply finished a task. One of the helicopter pilots leaned closer. "We heard your voice on the emergency frequency," he said. "We knew it was you." She raised an eyebrow lightly. "You were supposed to be training." "We were," he answered. "But when Storm calls Mayday, we listen." She allowed herself a small breath of laughter at that. Storm. The name had followed her for years. It was not given because she was loud or dramatic. It was given because when situations became chaotic, when others froze, she moved. The rain slowed to a drizzle. Emergency lights dimmed. Passengers were being escorted inside the terminal. As she finally stepped away from the aircraft and toward the building, the applause followed her again, softer now, more human. Not for a hero on a stage, but for a quiet woman from row 8 who had simply refused to let 160 strangers fall asleep forever. And as she walked through the terminal doors, blending back into the world of ordinary travelers, one truth remained clear in every person who had witnessed it. Some leaders do not announce themselves. They wait quietly, until the moment they are needed. The airport hotel room was quiet, too quiet. After the flashing lights, the engines, the radio calls, and the applause, silence felt almost unfamiliar. The woman from row 8 sat on the edge of the bed, still in the same simple clothes she had boarded in. Her small travel bag rested on the desk. Her phone lay face down beside it, buzzing every few seconds. She didn't pick it up immediately. For the first time that day, her hands were still. The adrenaline had faded, but now the weight of it all began to settle in. Not fear, not pride, just awareness. One small crack in a metal seam, one slow drop in oxygen, one captain's strained voice. That was all it would have taken. She leaned back slightly and closed her eyes. In her mind, she replayed the checklist. Descent angle, oxygen flow, radio call, flap setting, crosswind correction, touchdown timing. Not because she doubted herself, because that was how she had been trained. You review the mission, you learn from it, you improve for next time. Her phone buzzed again. This time she turned it over. Missed calls, messages, notifications stacking faster than she could read them. News alerts, social media tags, headlines forming around her name. Passenger lands jet after crew collapse. Military commander saves 160 lives. Storm in the sky. She exhaled slowly. She hadn't told anyone she was traveling. She had taken leave quietly. No escort. No special seat. No announcement. She had wanted 2 weeks of being normal. Now that privacy was gone. A soft knock came at the hotel door. She stood and opened it. A young airline representative stood there, nervous but respectful. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "the airline would like to arrange a press statement tomorrow morning, and the FAA investigators would like to speak with you tonight if possible." She nodded once. "I'll speak with them," she replied. "Keep it simple." "Yes, ma'am." When the door closed, she sat again and finally made one phone call. It rang twice. "Hello?" A warm voice answered. "It's me," she said softly. There was a pause. "I saw the news," the voice replied. Not shocked, not panicked, just steady. "You okay?" "I'm fine." I figured. Her mother didn't ask dramatic questions. She had raised a daughter who climbed trees to rescue stray cats at 7 years old. A daughter who joined the military when others hesitated. A daughter who ran toward trouble, not away from it. "You were supposed to be here tonight," her mother said gently. "I know," she answered. "I'll take the first flight tomorrow." "Of course you will." There was silence between them for a moment. "I'm proud of you," her mother added quietly. The woman in the hotel room looked down at her hands. "I was just in the right place." "You were prepared," her mother corrected. "That's different." After they hung up, she sat in the dim light and thought about that sentence. Prepared. That was the real story. Not luck. Not heroics. Not fate. Preparation. Years of training for emergencies that rarely happen. Hours spent recognizing the feeling of low oxygen. Hundreds of landings in bad weather. Endless drills that seemed repetitive until the day they weren't. That was what saved the flight. Not magic. Training. Later that night, she met with investigators in a small conference room. They asked precise questions. She answered with precise timelines. "No exageración." No drama. "When did you first suspect cabin pressure loss?" "Approximately 3 minutes before the captain's announcement." "What indicators?" "Physical symptoms. Slight cognitive dullness. Change in airflow sound." "Why initiate descent before masks deployed?" "Because waiting would reduce time margin." Every answer was clear, calm, focused on process. One investigator leaned back after 2 hours and said quietly, "Most people would have panicked." She shook her head. "Panic wastes oxygen," she replied simply. The next morning, cameras waited. Reporters gathered. Microphones pointed. She stood at the podium in a pressed uniform this time, medals resting against her chest. The same woman from row 8, but now visible. "How did you feel taking control of a commercial aircraft you've never trained on?" one reporter asked. "I felt responsible," she answered. "Did you feel fear?" "I felt urgency." "Do you consider yourself a hero?" She paused. "No," she said calmly. "I consider myself trained." Behind the cameras, one of the Black Hawk pilots watched quietly. He had come to stand in the back, not to be seen. After the press conference, he approached her. "They're calling you a legend again," he said lightly. She gave him a small look. "Legends don't do checklists." He smiled. "Still, ma'am." That was something. She adjusted her cap slightly. "The mission was simple," she said. "Bring everyone home." That afternoon, she finally boarded another flight. No storm this time. Clear skies. Ordinary passengers. She took a window seat again. Row 8. The plane lifted smoothly into calm blue air. And for the first time since the emergency, she allowed herself to simply look out at the clouds. Not as a commander, not as a headline, but as a daughter going home for her mother's birthday. But somewhere in the sky behind her, on emergency frequencies and in control towers, one thing remained certain. If trouble rose again, Storm would answer. 2 weeks later, the sky looked completely different. No green-gray clouds. No flashing lights. No emergency frequency. Just a clear, early morning horizon stretching over an Army airfield. The woman from row 8 stood on the flight line before sunrise. The air smelled like fuel and wet grass. Helicopters rested in a straight line behind her, dark shapes against a fading night sky. She wore her uniform again, not for cameras this time, but because this was where she belonged. A young pilot approached carefully, helmet tucked under one arm. "Ma'am," he said, a little hesitant, "is it true you flew a commercial jet?" She glanced at him without smiling. "It's true I followed procedure," she replied. He nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am." The rotor blades of a nearby helicopter began to move slowly as ground crew prepared it for takeoff. The steady rhythm of machinery filled the air. She walked toward her assigned aircraft, running her hand lightly along the metal body as she passed. It wasn't dramatic. It was habit, a quiet check, a silent connection. Inside the cockpit, everything was familiar. Switches, gauges, controls. No headlamps, no applause. Just responsibility. Her co-pilot climbed in beside her. "Command wants you to speak to the new flight class later," he said. "They think your situation might inspire them." She adjusted her harness. "Inspiration is overrated," she answered calmly. "Discipline lasts longer." He hesitated, then asked the question most people had been thinking. "Were you scared?" She looked straight ahead for a moment before responding. "Fear is normal," she said. "Losing focus is not." The helicopter lifted smoothly off the ground as the sun began rising fully over the horizon. The sky shifted from purple to gold. The world below looked calm, ordinary. They flew a training route that morning. Nothing dramatic, just maneuvers, formation practice, communication drills. But something had changed. Word had spread across bases, across units, across branches. Pilots had heard the radio recording. They had heard the steady voice during the emergency descent. They had heard the Black Hawk pilot say, "That's our commander." Reputation in aviation does not come from press conferences. It comes from radios. Later that afternoon, she stood in front of a group of young aviators seated in folding chairs inside a hangar. They looked at her with open admiration. One of them raised a hand. What did it feel like, taking control in that moment? She folded her hands behind her back. "It felt like a checklist," she said simply. They looked confused. She continued, "When something goes wrong, you do not think about headlines. You do not think about fear. You think about the next correct step. Then the next one. Another trainee spoke up. What if you make the wrong decision? She met his eyes. Then you correct it quickly. Pride has no place in a cockpit. There was silence for a moment. One pilot in the back asked quietly, "Why didn't you tell anyone who you were when you boarded that flight?" She allowed herself a small pause before answering. "Because rank doesn't prevent emergencies," she said. "Preparation does." The room stayed still. She dismissed them shortly after. No long speech. No dramatic ending. As the trainees filed out, one of them whispered to another, "She doesn't even act like she saved anyone." She heard it. She didn't respond. That evening, alone in her office, she finally watched the news replay for the first time. The emergency landing. The applause. The interview clips. The camera had caught her stepping out of the cockpit. Calm. Direct. She turned it off halfway through. Her phone buzzed with a message from the commercial captain. "Thanks again." It read, "We owe you." She typed back a short reply. "Take care of your crew." Then she set the phone aside. Outside, another helicopter lifted into the darkening sky for night training. The sound of rotors carried across the base. She stood at the window and watched it climb. No reporters. No storm. No crisis. Just another aircraft rising safely into the air. And that, more than anything, was what mattered. Because for her, the mission had never changed. It wasn't about the day the captain yelled. It wasn't about the headlines. It was about the same quiet promise she had made years ago when she first put on a uniform. If something goes wrong in the sky, stay steady, stay sharp, bring everyone home. Months passed. The storm that day became a story people told at dinner tables, in offices, in flight schools. News clips faded from the front pages, replaced by newer headlines. Social media moved on to the next trending topic. But for 160 people, the memory never faded. One passenger kept the oxygen mask from that flight in his drawer at home. The airline had replaced it during inspection, but he had asked quietly if he could keep the damaged one that had fallen into his lap. Not as a souvenir, as a reminder. A mother on that flight began hugging her children longer before school every morning. A business owner who had been on board decided to retire early, finally choosing time over money. A college student switched her major to aerospace engineering after realizing how fragile and powerful flight could be at the same time. And somewhere far from the airport where it all happened, the woman from row 8 continued living the way she always had. One evening, long after the headlines had quieted, she was walking alone along the edge of the base runway. The sun was setting in slow orange layers. Training flights had ended for the day. The sky was calm. A maintenance worker recognized her and nodded respectfully. "Ma'am," he said. She nodded back. "No cameras. No applause. Just routine." Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket. It was a message from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her open it. "Hello. You don't know me personally. I was sitting 3 rows behind you on that flight. I just wanted to say, my daughter was on that plane. She's 6. She still talks about the quiet lady who flew the plane. I just wanted you to know she's not afraid of flying anymore because of you." She read it twice, then a third time. She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she looked up at the runway stretching in front of her. The sky was clear now, but she remembered the green-gray clouds from that day. She remembered the strange silence before the captain's voice. She remembered the weight of the controls in her hands. She typed back a short message. "I'm glad she feels safe. That's what matters." That night, she sat alone in her small office and pulled out an old notebook from her first year in training. Inside, on the first page, she had written something in simple block letters. "Stay calm. Learn the system. Protect the crew." She smiled slightly at the handwriting. Younger, less steady. Back then, she had been just another trainee trying to prove herself. She hadn't imagined landing a commercial jet. She hadn't imagined headlines. She had imagined one thing only: being ready. A few days later, she was assigned a night mission. Routine transport. Nothing dramatic. The sky was dark but stable. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the air. As she flew, The world below turned into small lights and shadows. The cockpit glowed softly from instrument panels. Her co-pilot ran through radio checks. Everything was normal. Halfway through the route, air traffic control reported light turbulence ahead. She adjusted slightly. Small correction. Smooth hands. Her co-pilot glanced at her. "You ever think about that flight?" he asked quietly. "Sometimes," she answered. "What sticks with you?" She thought for a moment before replying. "The silence before action," she said. "That's when decisions matter most." He nodded. The helicopter continued forward, cutting cleanly through the night air. When they landed, a young ground crew member approached shyly. "My brother was on that commercial flight," he said. "He told us what happened." She looked at him. "He's doing well?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good." He hesitated, then added, "We're glad you were on that plane." She gave him a small, genuine smile. "So am I." Years later, the story would still be told among pilots. Not in loud celebration, not exaggerated, just as a quiet example. If you train hard enough, if you stay steady enough, if you don't freeze when others do, you can change the outcome. Back in her quarters that night, she placed her flight helmet on the desk and sat by the window. Another aircraft lifted into the sky in the distance, its lights blinking steadily. She watched it rise until it became just another star. The world would never know every detail of what happened inside that cockpit. The fear, the calculations, the seconds ticking by. But that was fine, because the real story was never about recognition. It was about responsibility. Some leaders speak loudly, some demand attention, and some sit quietly in row 8, reading a book, unnoticed, until the moment the captain yells, "We're in trouble." And when that moment comes, they stand up,